Hey there, Night Owl. Or maybe you're already half asleep, drifting in and out of a dream that smells faintly of old parchment and roasted turnips. Either way, welcome. Tonight's gentle ramble through the mossy alleyways of the past is going to be all about fun. Yes, fun. Because, contrary to popular belief, medieval people did not spend every hour getting plague, building cathedrals, or being crushed by feudal expectations. They also laughed, danced, played games, gossiped, and sometimes, brace yourself, took actual days off. Before we dive in, if you enjoy this sleepy, slightly sarcastic stroll through history, consider subscribing or leaving a like. But only if you mean it. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and whether you're already under the covers or still doing that weird thing where you sit in bed scrolling while pretending you're about to sleep. Okay, get cozy, maybe dim the lights. Or light a candle if you're going full medieval. Let the sounds of the world fall away. No more pings, dings, or algorithmically tailored outrage. Just the soft crackle of imagination and the slightly questionable hygiene of history. Now, let's be honest. When someone says Middle Ages, most people imagine misery. Dull gray peasants trudging through endless mud, knights yelling, nuns silently judging, and someone definitely dying of a toothache. Fun? Not exactly the first word that comes to mind. But the truth is far weirder and, frankly, more charming. Because medieval people, in their own drafty, flea-bitten way, had fun. Lots of it. And no, not just drinking themselves into oblivion, though that happened too. They played board games. They attended traveling puppet shows. They danced in village squares. They threw festivals that made modern music festivals look positively tame. Fewer drugs, more roast goose. And they loved stories. Long ones. Silly ones. Even ghost stories, which were told in flickering candlelight by people who genuinely believed the devil might be hiding in their laundry. Their fun was shaped by their world. Seasons, saints, days, available livestock, and local superstition. There were no weekends, but there were feast days, sometimes dozens per year. Days when work stopped, the ale flowed, and even the most serious monk might crack a smile. Some activities were communal, like maypole dances or mystery plays. Others were solitary, carving little wooden animals, making up poems, or just watching the fire flicker while imagining that you lived in a castle instead of next to a goose with boundary issues. This episode isn't going to be about the Black Death, though it might show up wearing a funny hat. It won't be about war, famine, or ecclesiastical tax reform. No, tonight is about joy. Strange, unexpected, but very real joy. The kind that sneaks in between the cracks of hard life. The kind that says, yes, I may sleep on straw and eat turnips, but today there's a puppet show, and I'm not missing it. So over the next several blocks, we'll explore the many odd and surprisingly delightful ways medieval people entertained themselves. Some will make you smile, some will make you wince, and a few might make you want to try them at your next Renaissance fair. Fair warning. We'll look at games, from chess to goat-butting contests. Yes, really. We'll visit taverns and tournaments, explore festivals and fire dances, and peek into the surprisingly gossipy world of medieval jesters. There'll be music, storytelling, riddles, beer, and at least one very confused dancing bear. Think of this as your medieval Netflix binge, without the autoplay or the existential dread. Each chapter is a standalone peek into the past, so you can snooze off whenever you like and pick up later without missing a plot point, so tuck yourself in. Let the 21st century melt away and prepare to time travel not to a battlefield or a throne room, but to a rickety wooden stage in a muddy town square, where a juggler just dropped his torch and everyone's laughing, Let's begin our entertainment tour with something low risk, low budget, and deeply satisfying. Games. No horses, no fire breathers, no holy relics involved. Just you, a board, maybe some dice, and a healthy willingness to lose your coin pouch to a monk, with suspiciously good luck. Board games weren't just for the bored. In medieval Europe, they were wildly popular, not just among monks and nobles, but even among peasants when the work was done, which, to be fair, happened less often than anyone liked. And no, it wasn't always about gambling, though let's be honest, it was often about gambling. Let's talk about chess. Yes, that chess. Kings, queens, bishops, knights. The game you now associate with libraries, stress, and smug uncles. It actually made its way into Europe around the 9th or 10th century, likely through Spain via contact with the Islamic world. And by the 12th century, it was all the rage among the upper classes. But here's the twist, it wasn't always noble and elegant. Early versions of European chess were rough around the edges. The queen used to move like a turtle with a sprained ankle, just one square diagonally. And the bishop? That was an elephant in earlier versions. Try picturing that on your grandma's chess set. Over time, the game evolved and became weirdly political. In some regions, the church worried it encouraged laziness and gambling. In others, it was seen as a mark of intelligence and good breeding. The French were particularly intense about it, naturally. They saw chess as a symbol of strategy, morality, and the medieval version of being, quote, emotionally available yet mysterious. But chess wasn't the only game on the table. Backgammon was popular too, a mix of luck and strategy played on a folding board with dice. And where there are dice, there is danger. The church hated dice games, mostly because they were impossible to spiritualize. At least chess could be spun as a battle between order and chaos. Dice? That was just randomness with a side of cheating. And speaking of cheating, let's not ignore that medieval dice were often not as honest as they looked. Weighted, shaved, or carved ever so slightly wrong, it wasn't uncommon to end up losing your sheep over a game you never had a chance of winning. For the more intellectual types, or the ones with too much time in monasteries, there was rhythmomachia, the so-called philosopher's game, picture chess, but with math, and philosophy, and shapes, and no chance of actually finishing a match unless you'd skipped 3 meals and 2 prayers. It involved capturing pieces using equations, ratios, and perfect squares. It was part entertainment, part cosmic symbolism. Honestly, it sounds like someone took a math textbook and said, what if this made people cry for fun? Children had their own simpler amusements. Knucklebones, a game like jacks, but with actual animal bones. Various versions of tag, and little strategy games drawn in the dirt. Dice were a favorite, of course, because what's childhood without the occasional early gambling habit? Interestingly, monks were among the most dedicated players of board games, especially in the winter months when going outside meant death by sleet. Their cloisters often had carved wooden boards, and some even had game pieces carefully stored in reliquaries. Because if you're going to play, why not involve the remains of a saint? Gambling wasn't always for coin. Sometimes it was for favors or food, or who had to go out and deal with the livestock, which means it was one of the earliest known forms of not it. And here's a fun detail. Games didn't stop at the table. The church sometimes hosted morality plays where life itself was treated like a board game. Souls were moved across metaphorical squares by angels and devils, and the audience learned the moral through a mix of laughter and mild existential dread. Entertainment and salvation, all in one sitting. So, the next time you roll a die or play a quiet game of chess, just imagine a 12th century monk doing the same, possibly while whispering a prayer that he rolls a 6, and not because he's scared of God, but because Brother Paul bet a chicken on the outcome and he's really hungry. Now, let's take a sharp turn away from dusty board games and toward something louder, brighter, and potentially roast goose flavored, the medieval fair. Because if you were alive in, say, 1350 and desperate for a break from plowing, praying, or pretending your lice weren't winning the war, the village fair was your Coachella. Fairs and festivals were the highlight of the medieval social calendar, and frankly, they were glorious chaos. These weren't quiet affairs with finger sandwiches and polite applause. These were full-blown sensory explosions. Picture a muddy field transformed with colorful banners, food stalls, puppet shows, musicians, dancers, jugglers, merchants yelling about miracle powders. And that one guy insisting he's definitely not selling cursed chicken bones. Again, fairs were usually timed to religious feast days or harvest milestones. Clever planning, since they gave everyone an excuse to both honor God and enjoy 3 days of eating, shopping, and flirting with someone else's cousin. They could last anywhere from a single afternoon to 2 weeks, depending on the size of the town and whether the local lord was feeling generous or just needed to distract everyone from new taxes. Merchants came from far and wide, bringing goods that felt exotic even if they were just from 2 towns over. Spices from the east, wool from Flanders, shiny things from who knows where. If you were lucky and wealthy, you could buy a silk scarf. If you were not, you could still leave with a wooden spoon, a pickle, or a highly suspect love charm carved from antler. And let's talk about food. The real star of any medieval festival. Forget boiled turnips, unless they were boiled in beer, which happened. Fairs were where people indulged. Honey cakes, roasted meats, fruit tarts, soft cheeses, candied nuts, ale that tasted slightly less like disappointment. You could eat your fill, assuming you didn't mind standing next to someone juggling geese while a goat tried to chew your sleeve. There were also games and contests. Wrestling matches, archery challenges, and who can throw this rock the farthest without spraining something important. Prize? Pride. Maybe a chicken. Or just the right to claim victory forever at the local tavern. Music? Oh, plenty. Minstrels with lutes and fiddles, drums made from questionable animal skins, and songs passed down orally that mostly revolved around saints, drinking, or livestock-related double entendres. Everyone joined in. Even if they didn't know the words, they knew the vibe. And if they didn't know the vibe, ale helped. But festivals weren't all innocent joy. Oh no! There was mischief too. Drinking competitions that went too far. Masked dances where people suddenly forgot who they were married to. Staged mock trials, where village idiots were crowned as kings for a day, only to have their fake thrones pulled out from under them with laughter, or thrown in a pond. Harmless fun, unless you had a sinus infection. The church, in its usual "we're not mad, just disappointed" mode, tolerated many of these festivities, as long as things didn't get too wild. But occasionally they did. Some festivals got banned for excessive dancing. Others because someone brought a bear to a maypole dance and chaos ensued. It happens. Now, what's often forgotten is how egalitarian festivals could be. Sure, nobles had their own fancier celebrations. More swan, fewer fleas. But village fairs allowed everyone to participate. Rich, poor, young, old. It was a rare moment where society felt a little more level. A place where the baker's apprentice could outdance the blacksmith, and where the priest might sneak a second sausage roll before pretending to be shocked by the music lyrics. So yes, medieval life was hard, but when the fair rolled into town, the pigs were brushed, the ale was warmed, and for a few muddy, musical days, joy took over. Let's now wander into a slightly noisier corner of medieval fun, comedy, or, as they might have called it, verbal mischief performed with bells on. Because before Netflix specials, open mic nights, and carefully curated sarcasm on Twitter, there were jesters. professional fools with sharp tongues, louder wardrobes, and job security that relied heavily on not offending the wrong duke at the wrong time. Now, the image of a medieval jester is almost a cartoon. Floppy hat with bells, mismatched clothes, a stick with a tiny version of themselves on top. The bauble. And sure, some of that's true. Jesters did wear eccentric costumes. They did carry props. And yes, they sometimes did make fart jokes in front of royalty. But there was more to them than pratfalls and puns. These performers were not just clowns. They were satirists, musicians, actors, and professional truth-sayers, or as close to that as one could get without being set on fire for heresy. A good jester could insult the king, poke fun at court officials, and make biting political commentary, all while dancing like a man possessed by jazz. A bad jester? Well, let's just say we don't have a lot of records from those guys. Jesters existed in royal courts, city halls, and sometimes wandering between villages like medieval stand-up comedians doing the tavern circuit. They weren't always low-born. Some were educated. Some could juggle 5 apples and recite Latin. Others could only juggle 3 apples, but did it while making impressions of local bishops, which, honestly, might have been more entertaining. And their humor? Brutal. Today, if a comedian bombs, they get heckled. In the Middle Ages, the crowd might throw vegetables, or stones, or a duck. One 14th-century jester, Roland Le Péteur, was reportedly paid in land on the condition that he perform an annual routine that ended with a leap, a whistle, and a loud fart. Yes, a royal fart, with choreography. But jesters weren't the only comedic outlet. Minstrels, traveling musicians and storytellers, carried gossip, jokes, and scandalous songs from village to village. They sang of love, war, saints, and tavern mishaps. They could turn your neighbor's bad haircut into a ballad, and your mayor's embarrassing wine spill into a local legend. They were human Twitter threads, minus the hashtags, plus a lute. Medieval comedy was earthy, direct, and very, very physical. Think slapstick before it had a name. Think people falling off carts and blaming it on the devil. Think of mystery plays, where the actor playing Satan kept tripping accidentally just to make the crowd laugh. Even religious performances, solemn events in theory, had comic relief. The devil characters were often written as bumbling, red-nosed buffoons, to teach moral lessons, sure, but also because everyone secretly enjoyed watching evil get pantsed. And it wasn't all public performance. Humor thrived in households, in alehouses, in whispered jokes behind the woodshed, wordplay, riddles, local satire, even rude embroidery. Yes, it existed. Were all fair game. You could find comic illustrations in manuscripts, bunnies jousting, monks stealing geese, demons with trumpet butts. If it made someone chuckle, it made the cut. One beloved comic format was the mock sermon, a fake religious speech filled with nonsense Latin, absurd metaphors, and over-the-top theatrics. These were performed by students or young clerics, often to haze newcomers or, lighten the mood between outbreaks of dysentery. Of course, humor was risky. What one person saw as witty, another might see as reason for a public whipping. But laughter was worth the gamble. It cut through the monotony of mud and rules and worry. It reminded people they were still human, even if covered in goose feathers from a poorly aimed prank. So next time you imagine the Middle Ages as all silence and solemnity, picture this: a fool in mismatched leggings standing in a royal hall, performing a musical number about the bishop's bald spot, while everyone, nobles, knights, and the bishop himself, tries not to snort ale out their noses. Let's say you lived in the Middle Ages and weren't into board games or fart-based performance art. What if your idea of a good time involved hitting things with sticks, preferably while on a horse? Well, friend, medieval Europe had just the hobby for you. Welcome to the world of chivalric sports, combat games, and martial pastimes, where grown men in plate armor attempted to stab each other for fun and sometimes for property. Let's start with the tournament. Not a formal war, but more like an organized, barely contained chaos parade on horseback. Tournaments were grand events held in fields outside castles or walled cities, drawing huge crowds. Nobles came to compete, peasants came to watch, and the vendors came to overcharge everyone for meat pies. The most famous event in these tournaments was the joust. 2 knights, 2 horses, 1 very long stick, technically called a lance, and a whole lot of speed. The goal? Hit the other guy hard enough to unhorse him, or at least make it look dramatic. Extra points for snapping your lance into splinters. Bonus points if no one lost a tooth. Now, these jousts weren't always the shiny, choreographed affairs we see in movies. Early on, they were closer to full-on brawls. The lines between sport and accidentally started a war were blurry. In fact, melees, another tournament event, were large group fights where teams of knights charged at each other like a medieval rugby match, minus the ball and with significantly more concussions. Participants could win prizes, glory, or even land in horses, especially if they managed to capture an opposing knight and demand a ransom. Think of it as the world's most dangerous poker game, but with armor and ego instead of cards. Mythbuster time. Many people imagine these knights as spotless paragons of honor, politely nodding before battle. In reality, knights were often rowdy, competitive, and occasionally terrible sports. Some brought sharpened weapons. Others cheated. One was reportedly arrested for attacking an opponent after the match, while still in full armor, which is both illegal and impressively stubborn. And here's the twist. The audience loved it. Watching knights crash into each other at full gallop, that was peak entertainment. Children screamed, nobles placed bets, and the local blacksmith started calculating how many helmets he'd need to repair by morning. Of course, martial sport wasn't just for the elite. Fencing, wrestling, archery, and quarterstaff duels were popular with the working class. Towns often held archery contests where hitting the mark wasn't just about bragging rights. It was law. In England, for instance, some men were required to practice archery on Sundays because, apparently, nothing says religious observance like pointy sticks and peer pressure. Then there were the ridiculous sports. One preserved German festival account describes people trying to chase a greased pig across a courtyard. Another records an early version of tug-of-war over a moat. No rope, just people. You can imagine how that ended. Wet, very wet. Mock duels were also common, sometimes with wooden swords, sometimes with turnips, and sometimes with sticks too large to be practical. These were especially popular during festivals, where people were encouraged to challenge their friends in friendly combat or settle old arguments under the thin veil of sport. Monks and clerics weren't always above these things either. In some monasteries, fencing with wooden sticks became a low-key hobby. One rulebook had to be updated to include, "Please stop breaking windows during combat drills," always a good sign. So yes, medieval fun could involve dancing and dice, but it also involved full-body tackles, surprise injuries, and noblemen dramatically sulking when they lost. But for the audience, it was entertainment gold. The sports of the Middle Ages weren't just for training warriors. They were for showing off, blowing off steam, and giving the crowd something to gasp at, or laugh at, or occasionally run away from when things got out of hand. And so, under the banners and cheers, amid the clatter of hooves and the occasional unplanned trip to the barber surgeon, the medieval sportsman was born, equal parts knight, showman, and walking insurance risk. So far, we've seen knights jousting, jesters jesting, and monks doing questionable fencing in the cloister garden. But let's come back down to the village square, where the real creative chaos lived, among the common folk, who knew how to turn boredom, livestock, and gravity into hours of entertainment. Because when you're a medieval peasant with no Wi-Fi, no books, and the same turnip stew 4 nights a week, you learn to improvise. Let's start with the game of mob football. Now, if you're picturing a friendly five-a-side match with tidy goals and polite applause, stop. Replace that mental image with 100 muddy people in tunics, a pig's bladder as the ball, and 0 rules. That's medieval football. The field could be a whole village. Goals were sometimes miles apart. And the objective? Move the ball any way you can to the other end, using feet, hands, elbows, a stick, or pure hope. There were injuries, broken ribs, lost teeth, occasionally minor property damage. One town banned the game entirely after someone's cart was turned into an impromptu goalpost and then set on fire. But it kept coming back. Because it was fun, violent, chaotic, communal fun. If football was too intense, there were tamer games like Skittles, an ancestor of bowling, played by knocking down pins with a carved wooden ball. You could find makeshift Skittle alleys in tavern yards, or wherever there was enough room and not too many chickens to accidentally concuss. Children loved it. Adults turned it into a betting game. Ale may have been involved. Then there was hoodman blind, essentially blind man's bluff. One person wore a hood or cloth over their eyes and had to catch others using only sound and chaos. People loved it, especially spectators. Because nothing says good time like watching your neighbor trip over a goat while blindfolded. Tug-of-war existed too, though not always with ropes. Sometimes it was hands only. Sometimes it involved teams pulling a single person. In a few festivals, people tugged each other through mud pits. Not to win anything, just to see who could stay upright the longest. Spoiler, it wasn't you. Let's not forget stool ball, an early relative of cricket and baseball. One person guarded a stool or small post, while another tried to hit it with a leather ball. The goal? Don't let the stool fall. The other goal? Arguably flirt. Stool ball was often a game for young people, especially during holidays, and was as much about eye contact as it was about athleticism. Animal games? Yes, definitely yes. People raced pigs. Not horses. Pigs. They also tied bells to cats. Tails. Less fun for the cat. Trained dogs to perform tricks. Or tried to ride geese, which never ended well for anyone involved, especially the geese. There were even reports of dancing bears brought in by traveling entertainers, though that crosses from quirky fun into uncomfortable history, so we'll tiptoe past it for now. Winter offered sled races, sometimes down icy hills, sometimes down that one suspiciously angled roof that hadn't been repaired since last spring. People also made snowmen, had snowball fights, and played, quote, who can stay outside longest without crying. Children had endless amusements, hoops made from bent branches, tops spun with whittled sticks, miniature bows and arrows made from unfortunate twigs. They played tag, leapfrog, king of the hill, and games that were basically who can jump the farthest without landing in something suspicious. But what really set medieval peasant fun apart was how often it veered into the gross. This was a society without much in the way of hygiene or shame, so it's no surprise that some games involved throwing animal bladders or flinging filth, usually for bets, sometimes for revenge, occasionally just for laughs. And if you think drinking wasn't part of the fun, oh, friend, peasants brewed weak ale that was safe to drink, unlike the water, and games often spiraled into full-blown ale-fueled competitions. Who can balance on one leg the longest? Who can recite the Lord's Prayer backward? Who can burp the alphabet in Latin? These were real contests. Prizes included leftover bread, bragging rights, and minor concussions. Yes, it was crude, often dangerous, occasionally ridiculous. But it was joy, born not from luxury, but from necessity. The games of the common folk were loud, shared, and gloriously unregulated. They turned hardship into hilarity, boredom into bruises, and strangers into teammates, even if only until someone got hit in the face with a muddy turnip. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you probably didn't own much. Maybe a wooden bowl, a few itchy tunics, and a chicken that respected no boundaries. But one thing everyone carried, rich, poor, noble, or peasant, was a repertoire of songs, stories, and scandalous gossip. Music and storytelling weren't just entertainment. They were memory, they were news, they were therapy before anyone knew what therapy was. And they were the social glue that held villages, courts, and monasteries together, preferably in harmony, but sometimes just in rhythm. Let's start with music. No medieval evening was complete without it. People sang while working, praying, drinking, or walking to the gallows. Seriously, there are records of condemned men singing dirges before execution. Dark, but musical. And it wasn't all religious chant or moody monk humming. There were love songs, drinking songs, lullabies, nonsense songs, and ballads about knights doing very unknightly things. If you think all medieval music was solemn and droning, think again. Folk music was lively, catchy, and full of innuendo. Picture sea shanties with a hurdy-gurdy. Instruments varied. Peasants strummed lyres, blew on reed pipes, or clapped spoons together with enthusiasm that far exceeded their skill. In towns and courts, you'd find lutes, harps, fiddles, and shawms. Think medieval saxophone with fewer love ballads and more aggressive geese sounds. Drums made from animal hides added rhythm. Bells and tambourines were used liberally. Coordination was optional. The musicians themselves? Sometimes professionals, like minstrels or troubadours, who traveled from court to court, bringing songs and gossip. Other times they were just that one uncle who refused to stop playing the same 3 chords on his lute while everyone tried to eat. Some songs were passed down for generations. Others were improvised on the spot. The miller's daughter and the drunken friar might be composed one evening, performed the next, and forgotten by dawn, or become a local classic. But song wasn't the only soundtrack. Stories were huge. Think Netflix, TikTok, and Reddit combined, all powered by memory and mouth. Every evening gathering, every feast, every tavern had someone ready to spin a yarn. Knights who fought dragons, saints who defeated demons, ghosts who haunted old barns. And yes, talking animals with surprisingly good political instincts. Monasteries wrote and copied serious works, but they also passed around miracle tales, visionary dreams, and the occasional monk-written comedy about flatulent devils. Literacy was rare, but storytelling didn't need books, just a voice and an audience. Some people specialized in riddle contests, brain teasers with answers like the sun or an eel in a bucket. Others focused on morality tales, where the greedy baker gets turned into a toad, or the unfaithful knight wakes up bald. And then, of course, there was gossip, the medieval newswire. The baker's daughter ran off with a visiting monk. The blacksmith's apprentice was caught spooning with the tanner's goat. Probably not true, but retold enthusiastically. Even nobles weren't safe. Court minstrels spread juicy stories disguised as songs. Oh no, my lord, this ballad about a greedy, two-faced duke with gout has nothing to do with you, obviously. Taverns and market days were prime gossip territory. Everything from who had the best mead to whether the local lord's new wife was cursed made the rounds. Gossip was entertainment and survival. It told you who to trust, what to avoid, and whether that weird new healer with the mysterious herbs was actually a witch. Spoiler, sometimes. In fact, medieval gossip was so structured that there were even official punishments for spreading slanderous tales. But did that stop anyone? Not remotely. You could fine a miller for saying the priest's new boots looked cursed. but you couldn't stop the story from spreading, especially if it rhymed. So, whether it was music played on a string that hadn't been tuned since Advent, or a whispered story passed around a fire, or a scandalous song hummed by kids who definitely didn't understand the lyrics, sound and story filled every crevice of medieval life. And when the night grew quiet and the fire dimmed low, someone always had one more verse to sing, one more tale to tell, one more bit of mischief to share before sleep returned. And the dreams, of course, carried their own stories. By now, you've seen the medieval world laugh, dance, wrestle, and compose insulting songs about each other's bald spots. But let's turn down the lights a little, because fun in the Middle Ages wasn't always daylight and dice. Sometimes it came cloaked in mystery, wrapped in ritual, or dipped, quite literally, in holy water. Because in a world where science was still working out what the moon was, faith and folklore shaped everything, including entertainment. Let's start with the obvious: religious festivals. These weren't quiet affairs with solemn hymns and gentle handshakes. No, these were massive public events, colorful, noisy, dramatic, and occasionally filled with people dressed as angels trying not to trip over their wings. Feast days for saints, parades, church bells, big meals. Corpus Christi, giant processions through town, complete with reenactments, sacred relics, and possibly someone sweating inside a papier-mâché dragon costume. Easter, liturgical dramas, egg games, and sermons that included the theological equivalent of, "You should have seen what happened to that one Roman guy." Mystery plays were especially popular. Theatrical productions based on Bible stories, performed outdoors, often by local guilds. The butchers did the crucifixion. The bakers handled the Last Supper. The shipbuilders naturally did Noah's Ark. And yes, sometimes they actually built the Ark. These plays were moral, yes, but also theatrical spectacles. Picture real fire for hell scenes, staged fights between angels and demons, and audiences cheering when Satan got bonked on the head with a wooden sword. But religion wasn't all solemn or theatrical. Sometimes it was festively absurd. Enter the Feast of Fools. This was a short period around New Year's when junior clergy or lower-ranking officials would take over the church, wear silly costumes, mock the bishop, sing songs backward, and parade a donkey into the cathedral. It was part satire, part chaos, part necessary pressure release for a society full of rules. For one day, the sacred became silly, and everyone laughed. Myth note: this was real. The church tried to ban it multiple times. Unsurprisingly, that just made it more popular. And then we have folklore festivals, tied to the seasons. Spring brought maypoles, flower crowns, and dancing. That was about 40% fertility symbolism. Summer had bonfires, huge ones, lit on Midsummer's Eve to chase away evil spirits, or at least the mosquitoes. Autumn meant harvest celebrations with songs, games, and vague rituals involving bread shaped like vaguely human figures. And winter? Oh, winter was where it got spooky. Yuletide, the dark days of December, was a season full of strange traditions. Some Christian, some less so. There were tales of ghostly processions, wild hunts in the sky, and St. Nicholas judging children with unnerving enthusiasm. Some areas believed in household spirits who needed gifts or bribes. Others thought witches roamed more freely in the cold. It wasn't uncommon to place iron over doors or chalk runes near the hearth to encourage good dreams or discourage bad ones. Children were told not to go outside after dark during certain weeks because the wild hunt might swoop down and carry them off. No pressure, Timmy. Just sleep tight and try not to hear hoofbeats in the wind. And folklore wasn't just warnings, it was fun. It gave rise to games, songs, charms, and seasonal traditions. People bobbed for apples not just to eat them, but to divine the future. Girls peeled apples in one long strip and tossed it over their shoulder. If it landed in the shape of a letter, that was their future husband's initial. Sometimes it landed in the fire. That meant your true love was either dead, a monk, or already married. Whoops! Superstition meant entertainment everywhere. You might dance around a certain tree to ensure good harvests, or pour ale on the ground before drinking to keep the spirits friendly, or tie ribbons in your hair during specific moon phases so your dreams would be pleasant, or at least not involve pigs with human teeth. Even storytelling took on supernatural tones. Ghost tales were popular, especially in winter, when families huddled close and told of haunted abbeys, cursed woods, or the knight who made a deal with the devil and came back with hooves. Monks collected these tales, by the way, not always to condemn them, sometimes just to enjoy them. You'd be surprised how many illuminated manuscripts have little demons doodled in the margins, possibly during very boring sermons. So yes, the medieval world was full of faith, but not always the quiet kind. Sometimes it wore bells, danced around fires, and told stories about spectral dogs with glowing eyes. It was reverent, silly, superstitious, and utterly human. If you've stuck with us this far, through board games, pigs and football scrums, and minstrels singing about clerical scandals, then you're ready to enter one of the liveliest places in medieval daily life, the tavern. Now, the word tavern might conjure images of cozy candlelight, wooden mugs, and roguish strangers trading mysterious quests. And that's not completely wrong, but it was also louder, smellier, and involved more arguing about goats than you'd expect. Taverns were the unofficial community centers of the Middle Ages. They weren't just for drinking, though there was plenty of that. They were for meeting, singing, plotting, flirting, and occasionally hiding from your responsibilities until someone dragged you home by the collar. Let's talk drinks. The most common? Ale. Not the hoppy, craft kind you'd get today with a punny label, but a flat, yeasty brew made from water, grain, and hope. And most importantly, it was safer than drinking the water. Everyone drank ale. Adults, kids, even monks. It was thick, nourishing, and could be brewed weak enough for breakfast or strong enough to forget you owed the blacksmith 3 chickens. If you were fancier or just had a good harvest, you might afford mead, cider, or wine. But for most, it was ale all the way down, and with drink came games. First up, drinking games. These were usually simple and involved either singing, storytelling, or making increasingly poor decisions. Pass the cup was common, a single mug shared around the table, each person taking a drink and either telling a tale or performing a challenge. If you refused, you drank twice. One popular pastime was Truth or Dare, medieval edition, though they didn't call it that. They called it things like Dancing the Barrel or Rounds of Shame. It often included mildly embarrassing dares, riddles, or being forced to imitate the local priest after 3 ales. Dangerous but hilarious. Another game, tablero, a game involving throwing coins or pebbles onto a marked table, trying to knock your opponent's pieces out of a square. It was surprisingly addictive, especially when played with betting involved. And when someone lost badly, they might have to sing a rude song or wear a chamber pot on their head for the next round. Why? Because tavern rules. And then there was the performance element. Taverns often had a corner where traveling musicians, local poets, or just that one guy with a pipe would perform. Songs ranged from bawdy to barely intelligible. Some were made up on the spot. Others were well known, especially ones about animals, saints, or inappropriate confessions. Anyone could join in. The loudest singer wasn't necessarily the best, but they often got a free drink. Taverns were also breeding grounds for gossip, debate, and the occasional brawl, but these weren't chaotic brawls, at least not always. In many towns, taverns had informal rules for settling disputes. You insulted someone's beard? You might be challenged to a duel of dice, not daggers. Threw someone's hat in the stew pot? A slap fight in the alley. It was crude conflict resolution, but it worked. Usually. Fun fact: many medieval towns had tavern guilds, loosely organized groups of regulars who handled minor infractions, helped keep order, and occasionally declared themselves mayor of the ale table for the night. They had no real power, but wore the title like a crown. Taverns weren't always alcohol-drenched chaos, though. In the slower hours, they served as hubs for storytelling, informal matchmaking, and community planning. Farmers might strike deals. Travelers shared news. Young people made eyes at each other across mugs. Old people pretended not to notice and secretly placed bets. And if you think only men filled these spaces, think again. Women ran taverns, worked in them, drank in them, and occasionally outsang every man present. Some were known for their sharp tongues, faster jokes, or ability to balance a tray of 6 mugs while kicking a drunk guest out with 1 foot. So yes, taverns could be rowdy. But they were also safe harbors, loud, messy sanctuaries where people could let loose, laugh, play, and remember they were human. Because when life is mostly labor and obligation, a night of silly songs, slightly sour ale, and minor public humiliation, that's just good medicine. Let's pause the dancing, set down the dice, and gently back away from the tankard of questionable ale. Because not all medieval fun was loud, muddy, or performed in front of a donkey. Some of it was quiet, personal, peaceful in a way that feels surprisingly modern. In between the harvests, the holy days, and the high-stakes cabbage wrestling matches, medieval people also knew how to enjoy the rarest of luxuries, doing not much at all. Let's start with the garden. Not the frantic, dirt-under-your-nails kind, but the small patch of herbs and flowers that people tended for the pleasure of it. Monks were big on this. Cloister gardens were designed as meditative spaces, where one could contemplate the mysteries of the universe while pruning sage. But even peasants might have a few rows of lavender, mint, or rosemary tucked by the door, not just for cooking, but for the smell, the color, the stillness. Embroidery and sewing weren't just chores. They were also pastimes. Women, and some men, used needlework to create small, decorative pieces. Embroidered cuffs, symbolic motifs, even secret jokes stitched into hems. A young girl might sew a daisy pattern while singing to herself. A widow might mend for others while listening to stories at the fire. And yes, not all of it was serious. Some manuscript margins show stitched versions of, let's say, anatomically surprising animals. Apparently, embroidery could be a bit cheeky. Another quiet pleasure: carving. Wood carving was an art, a meditation, and occasionally a business. People carved spoons, combs, toys, religious symbols, and miniatures of animals, not necessarily to sell, often just to pass the time or give as small gifts. A shepherd might whittle during long hours in the fields. A monk might carve a devotional figure to keep in his cell. Children carved funny faces on sticks. Not everything had to be sacred. Sometimes it was just silly. Let's not overlook daydreaming. In an age with no screens, imagination had free rein. People made up stories, reimagined their favorite saints as adventurers, or pretended they were rich enough to own 2 pairs of shoes. Children played pretend games, knights and dragons, queens and magical cows. Adults did too, quietly, as they stirred pots or mended fences, because a good fantasy was as portable as a turnip and a lot more interesting. And then there was napping. Oh yes, medieval people loved a good nap. Especially in southern Europe, where midday breaks, the original siesta, were completely normal. But even in colder places, A quick snooze by the hearth, or a long pause on a sunny hill while pretending to watch the sheep was common. Life was physically demanding, but wherever possible, people built in rest, even if they didn't call it self-care. Listening to the world was a thing, too. You'd sit, watch the birds, hear the church bells in the distance, maybe eavesdrop on your neighbors arguing about apples. People were deeply attuned to nature and to each other. Not always by choice, but it shaped their sense of presence. They noticed cloud shapes, odd animal behavior, the sound of wind through different trees. You lived in it. Some leisure was introspective. Monks practiced contemplative prayer. Nobles might read poetry aloud to themselves. Even illiterate villagers might memorize a favorite verse or prayer and repeat it as a sort of mantra, not for display, not to impress, just because it felt good. And let's not forget the joy of doing nothing with someone else, sitting beside a friend in silence, mending clothes, or just staring at the fire. No expectations, no performance, just being. Together, in the quiet. You didn't always need a game or a song. Sometimes company was enough. Even the animals joined in. Cats napped in laps. Dogs snored by the hearth. Chickens pecked slowly through sunbeams. There's something profoundly comforting about imagining a peasant family, worn from work, just sitting quietly while the stew simmers, the child draws in ash on the floor, and someone snoozes with their face in a basket of clean laundry. So yes, medieval life was hard. But in between the struggle and the spectacle, there were pockets of peace, little rituals, slow hobbies, quiet pleasures that asked for nothing but time and attention. And maybe that's the most surprising joy of all. Not the dances, not the feasts, not the slapstick brawls, but the rare chance to sit back, breathe, and just be. And here we are, at the edge of our medieval carnival. The music has quieted, the tournaments have ended. The jester's hat is drooping beside a half-empty tankard. And what are we left with? A surprising truth. Medieval fun. Despite all the mud, the goats, and the risk of being trampled by a maypole dancer, wasn't so different from our own. It's easy to imagine medieval life as a gray blur of toil and plague, with joy rationed out like firewood. But the past is rarely that tidy. Even in the hardest centuries, people laughed, played, flirted, told stories, got silly, made mistakes, and danced in circles until they collapsed from dizziness and joy. Which is, honestly, not so different from what people do at weddings today. Look at how they played. Board games, dice, wrestling, sports with incomprehensible rules, all echoes of modern fun. The stakes were sometimes higher. Hello, jousting. But the thrill? The same. A moment of victory, a shared laugh, the delight of a clever move. The dramatic sigh when you lose to someone you're absolutely sure is cheating, but in a charming way. Look at how they celebrated. Fairs, feasts, festivals, performances in the town square, parades for saints and solstices. The details change, but the spirit endures. Food, music, spectacle, and a shared sense of occasion. Humans love excuses to gather, eat too much, and watch someone juggle something they probably shouldn't be juggling. Look at their humor. It was crass, clever, physical, satirical, and deeply human. They laughed at authority, at each other, and at themselves. They made fart jokes and theological puns. They teased, roasted, and rhymed insults. If you've ever been to a school play where a kid forgets their line and improvises with shocking confidence, you've basically witnessed a medieval morality play in action. Look at how they rested, with songs, slow games, quiet crafting, or just staring at the fire with someone they liked. They made space, however small, for doing nothing. Or at least, for doing something that felt like nothing. A walk. A whittled spoon, a whispered story by the hearth, the art of small joy. And yes, their fun was shaped by faith and fear, by superstition and survival. But so is ours, in different clothes. They found laughter in church rituals, magic in maypole dances, and gossip in the flicker of firelight. They made joy where they could, often from almost nothing. A chicken, a song, a good line in a bad poem. That's what makes their world feel familiar. Not the castles or cathedrals, not the armor or illuminated scrolls, but the moments between the chaos, the jokes, the games, the dance steps passed down by feet and laughter. In every era, people chase the same things: connection, celebration, escape. They want to feel seen, to feel clever, to forget, to belong, to laugh so hard they wake the sleeping cat. And so, we leave this medieval world not with a bang or a sermon, but with a smile. Because behind the myths and the mud was a deeply human rhythm, a heartbeat of fun, noisy, quiet, sacred, profane, that reminds us that even centuries ago, people were finding ways to enjoy the short time they had. And if that's not a bedtime thought worth keeping, what is?